Hi, welcome everybody. Happy Wednesday? My name is Whitney Garner. I'm a GMAT instructor at Manhattan Prep, and I am excited to be with you as part of this series on the GMAT critical reasoning. Let's go ahead and jump in. We are going to start this fine Wednesday morning here for me on the East Coast. I'd love to know where y'all are coming to me from. So if you are able to chat and you're in the chat window, please, by all means, let me know, where are you coming to me from? I did want you to know that this is part 2 in a 3-part series. The link to the first episode with my colleague Chris, where we introduce assumptions, strengthen, and weaken, can now be found in the description of the video. It's also popping up. But I would love to hear where folks are coming to me from this morning or afternoon or evening. Pleasure to be with you. Pleasure to be with you. We are going to get started. Just to kind of fill you in on where we are with kind of the big picture of this 3-part series. Our 3-part series is going to cover the 3 major areas of critical reasoning. So we'll look at, you saw if you've already attended with Chris, but in our first session, we did a find the assumption, strengthen, and weaken. So we started to work in this family of what are assumptions inside critical reasoning arguments. So definitely check out that lesson if you haven't already. It is packed full. We'll do a tiny bit of a review today to get started, but otherwise make sure that you check out that lesson. Our session today is the lesson on evaluate questions. So a bit of an extension on the assumption, strength, and weaken that we did last time. And then we're going to introduce a new question type called discrepancy. Along with that, we'll talk about a question type known as fill in the blank. And you'll find out that you've actually, by the end of today, already learned fill in the blank questions. They just look different. And then next time with my colleague, you'll be working on critical reasoning inference and then the bold-faced or structure-based problems. Yeah. So I'm excited to get us going. Yep, episode 2. We've got more series coming soon. Yep, following up with this. And so let's jump in. And again, let me know where you're coming to me from. It's great to hear people share where they're located this morning or this afternoon or even this evening for some of you, I know. So a little bit of an introduction. Yeah, we're going to connect. So that 4th session is going to be the connection of critical reasoning from the verbal section connected over to critical reasoning in the data insights area. Yeah, beautiful. So we'll start with more kind of functional critical reasoning to begin. Let's talk about the verbal section where critical reasoning finds its primary home. Yes, we do find some critical reasoning arguments in data insights in the 2-part, but most of your critical reasoning is going to be tested in the verbal section. For those of you working under standard time constraints, the verbal section is 23 questions with 45 minutes in total. We've got 2 different question types in the verbal section now. We've got critical reasoning and reading comprehension. They each make up about half of the questions, depending on how many passages for reading comp you see. So one thing I like to highlight when I sort of look at this verbal section as a big picture is the real clear distinction about what the GMAT wants you to be doing when it comes to critical reasoning and what they want you to be doing when it comes to reading comprehension. So reading comprehension, where you read the big long passage and then, off to the side is the question. Reading comprehension is here to test your ability to chew up large amounts of information, text-based information, and be a good researcher. So your job with reading comprehension is to read without putting your own spin or opinion on the material. Okay, so we don't want to do what I would call editorializing, meaning start to build opinions or draw big conclusions or move away from the text. We're trying to show that we are able to read material, internalize it, understand it, but without adulterating it, without changing it or manipulating it or trying to add our own spin on it. So questions are going to come directly from the screen. They're going to ask you for information that exists on the screen already somewhere. You will not be bringing in new information from the outside world to answer reading comp questions. That is very different from what the GMAT is expecting of a critical reasoning exercise. So critical reasoning are the exercises where you have a single argument, meaning a single paragraph at the top. You'll get one question, and that question typically involves something like, how would you strengthen this conclusion? What is the assumption the author is making, or an assumption that the author is making? How would you evaluate this conclusion? Or how would you draw your own conclusion? So in critical reasoning, our job isn't to just be a good researcher. Our job is instead to be analytical, to read an argument that an author has put forth, and then think really critically about that. What are some of the problems, the holes, the issues in that argument? How would we fill those holes with the assumption or with strengthen? How would we exploit those holes with things like weaken, we'll see evaluate, or even flaw? How do we take information and reconcile what feels like contradictory information? In most of these cases, we are going to be introducing new outside information in via our answer choices. So in the world of critical reasoning, it's a short amount of text. I'm not having to go through this massive amount of text like I do for reading comp. It's this much shorter amount of text, but my job is to start to think about, like, what is the author saying, but what are they not saying? Right? What is the author left out? What have they not envisioned, right, for this? Excellent. So that's the question type that we are exploring in this multi-part series. You've already, with my colleague earlier, and the link is in the description. It's in the chat right now for those of you here live. But that earlier lesson started to introduce the concepts of assumption and strengthen and weaken. So I want to do a little bit of a review for those of you that weren't able to attend, but we're going to kind of move through it pretty quickly. We'll start with what the building blocks of arguments actually are. So in critical reasoning, our building blocks are the things that are both on screen, but also in the author's head. So the first kind of main building block in the world of a critical reasoning argument. So for most of these critical reasoning exercises, the author will put forth an argument, meaning they're going to claim something, that we should do this to save money, or because of what's happening right now, this is what the future will look like, or because of what I'm seeing, it must be that this thing caused it. The author is 9 times out of 10 putting forth some form of a conclusion that they want you to believe in with them. So a conclusion on the screen is going to be the author's like main claim, main belief. It's their big selling point. There are some really nice signal words for this, words like so, thus, therefore, as a result. And so these kind of key us in that this is what the author really wants us to believe. This is what the author wants us to know. Now, inside the argument, the author is going to introduce certainly information that supports their conclusion. We're going to call these premises. So a premise is anything that the author is putting forth. Could be a fact, it could be another belief, but these are the things that the author is putting forth to say, my conclusion is true. Okay, so these argue for the conclusion. Signals here would be words like since or because, for, those types of things, right? That are like, because of this, here's my conclusion. Or I believe this since this other thing is true. The author might also introduce some counterpoints. Not always. I'd say maybe one in every handful of arguments, you'll get a counterpoint. A counterpoint is anything that the author is acknowledging, but maybe isn't super happy about. So these would be any facts that the author is saying, okay, I have to admit that this is true. It kind of goes against my conclusion, but if I don't admit it, you might call me out for it. So anything that we would call a counterpoint would be something that would technically work against our conclusion. Generally, the language of a counterpoint will be the language of what I call like sort of a concession, right? Like I concede that this is true, but we're still not going to let it phase us. So although this is true, while it's true that this product is very expensive, we really should still buy it. Now, even though it's so expensive, it's still worth it, right? And so I'm looking, when I look for a counterpoint, counterpoint is the language of concession. I'm acknowledging something negative, but it's not going to keep me from my ultimate conclusion. This is different, and we'll see, from transition language that just switches direction. So words like but and however, those have nothing to do with whether something is for an argument or against it, in fact. Words like but or however are just telling you that the argument is switching directions. So we might be going from a premise to a counterpoint. We might be going from a counterpoint to a premise. So note that when I'm trying to acknowledge something negative as the author, I'm not using but or however. If I'm trying to acknowledge something negative, I'm going to use concession, counterpoint language. I use words like but or however simply to move me from one thing to the other. So let's talk about like a relationship version of this. I could say to my partner, I love you so much, but well, what's coming is going to be the opposite of me loving you so much, right? I love you so much, but I really need you to do dishes more frequently. But I could have rewritten that, probably to better effect and a better relationship with my partner, if I'd switched the order and said instead, man, I really need you to do the dishes more often, right? Frustrated, but I love you so much, right? So what comes after the but could be really positive, it could be negative. The key to words like but and however are a transition, but not a tone. So we have one other aspect of an argument that's super important for at least the first of the two question types that we'll be doing today. And this is the assumption. Now, the key to the assumption is that it is not going to be on the screen. Sometimes authors will state something that feels assumption like. So an author might say, if something happens, then. So a really silly example, like if pigs fly, I'm going to draw the conclusion that they would be really slow and they would fly really low to the ground. Well, my conclusion, pigs would fly slowly and close to the ground, depends on this stated assumption that pigs can fly, which they can't. But sometimes an author will say, like, if this thing, then my conclusion. Right? If we sell as many units as we did last time, then we will make more money. In that case, it's technically a stated assumption, but in terms of our exercise and critical reasoning, we never look at stated assumptions. When we think about assumptions on the test as the test taker, we need to think about the things that the author isn't stating. So assumptions for our understanding of the critical reasoning exercise, assumptions are things that the author has not said. However, these are also things that the author clearly must believe because they are required for the argument to stand. Let me give you an example. If I try to build an argument for you that says, all dogs love peanut butter, it's all of them, all dogs love peanut butter. Therefore, Maddie loves peanut butter. I have clearly made an assumption. All dogs love peanut butter. Therefore, this thing called Maddie loves peanut butter. I have clearly made the assumption, it's in my head, that Maddie is a dog. But I didn't say that to you. I didn't say all dogs love peanut butter and Maddie is a dog. Therefore, Maddie would love peanut butter. I left that piece in the middle out. That piece, though, was absolutely necessary. I need to know that Maddie is a dog, or else I can't draw this conclusion. Okay, so when we think about assumptions, these are the things that are the connective tissue between what the author is saying is explicit and what the author is now claiming. So these assumptions are what we might think of as the holes in an argument, the missing bits of information that we need more of. So I want to start with a really simplistic argument. Let's take this argument, for example, an argument about our friends over at Zphone and a new product that they're selling. So take a moment. I want you to think, what are the pieces of this argument? What's the author's conclusion? Is there supporting evidence? Is there counter evidence? And then, what information might be missing? So let's take about 30 seconds or so, 45 seconds to kind of consider this argument. And what I'd love is for those of you here live, I would love to see, what do you think the conclusion of this argument is? What's the big sales pitch that the author wants us to believe? All right. So as we start to deconstruct this argument, it's pretty simplistic. There's only 2 sentences. So definitely a lot shorter than a lot of our kind of more common GMAT bulky arguments. But we can start to break it down into its composite pieces. What is on the actual screen, right? And so what's on the screen? Well, we have a conclusion. The conclusion here is that therefore the phone must have generated more profit. And this idea that it sold more units, so if we think about profit is a revenue minus a cost, right? So if I kind of put off in my mind that profit is revenue minus cost, we're told that it sold more units, that implies more revenue, which therefore implies greater profits. Sure, that feels logical enough. And so if we were to start to deconstruct this argument, we might see it in this, okay, I think that this is true, premise, therefore conclusion. So we can sort of map often in this space, premise, therefore conclusion. Premise, it's a fact, maybe it's a claim, but it's something that the author is stating that supports the conclusion. And then there's our conclusion, this like big claim. It will always be an opinion or a prediction, a guess, an expectation, and it will always need support. It will never be the case that a conclusion is true like a fact. Right? It won't be, therefore the phone did generate more profit. No, it'll be like must have, might have, will generate more profit. Okay, so an argument is generally going to include a premise and a conclusion. Again, there may be some counterpoints floating around out there, but not necessarily. One way I like to think of an argument is almost like we're trying to connect premise to conclusion like a bridge. That in order to get from our premise over to our conclusion, there's sort of this therefore bridge that needs supporting. It needs to have some support, some bridge actual supports, right? So so whatever you would kind of call the pieces that go up, right? These pillars, if you will. And so the question starts to become like, what do I need to assume? And again, an assumption is something that's unstated, and it's something that's going to bridge the gap between our premise and conclusion. So if we start to think of an assumption pillar, if you will, right? Like that props up our bridge. We might go back to this idea that profit is revenue minus cost. So what do y'all think? What is a potential assumption that our author is working with? What might be a possible assumption that our author is kind of in here believing without actually saying it out loud to us? Yeah, something around costs. Now, I want to be a little bit careful. The author, several of you said a couple of different things, right? That maybe it's that the author is assuming that the cost stayed the same. Maybe the author knows that, they just haven't bothered to tell us. The author might also be assuming that the cost went down and just didn't bother to tell us. They might have assumed that the cost didn't go up and they didn't tell us. When it comes to an assumption, what we generally want to think about is like worst case scenario. What has to be true? So does it have to be true that my costs stayed the same? So in order for my conclusion to survive, did my costs have to stay the exact same? Would they be allowed to change? What do y'all think? That could costs change a little? Well, so costs could change a little. It could stay the same. Costs even could have decreased. That would be allowed. In fact, like, wouldn't it technically be okay if costs went up some? Like, wouldn't I be allowed to let my costs go up? Yeah, my costs could absolutely go up so long as my costs don't go up so far that they wreck my increase in revenue, right? So if my revenue is up, and my costs go up, but maybe not a crazy amount, then my profits would still go up. So the assumption is often trying to make sure that the like worst case edge scenario doesn't happen. So I don't need to assume that my costs stayed the same because they didn't have to stay the same. I didn't need to assume that my costs went down. And in fact, I didn't even need to assume that my costs didn't go up because they could have gone up like a small amount, right? So in a sense, I need it to be the fact that my costs didn't go up so much as to cancel out my revenue increase. So great question. Like, wait, thinking about a ratio. For example, imagine that my revenue went up $1,000, right? But then my costs went up maybe $100. So what would have happened to my overall profit if my costs went up by 100 or 1,000, but my revenue only went up by, my revenue went up by 1,000, but my cost went up by 100, right? So what would have happened if revenue goes up by 100, or let's say 1,000 again, but my costs only went up by 100? What would my profit? What would have happened to my profit in this case? Yeah, my profit's still going to go up, right? My profit would go up $900. not as much as my revenue went up, but it didn't say that it went up as much as revenue. It just said my revenue increased and therefore my profit must have also increased. Yeah. Okay. So what do I need to assume? I need this like really kind of extreme assumption that cost didn't go up so much as to like cancel out this revenue increase. Okay. All right. So if this is the case, then let's think about what also fits into the assumption family of pieces here. So things like strengthen and weaken, and then we're going to include today's question type, evaluate. So in the world of assumptions, assumptions act as the pillar. Cost increase didn't offset revenue increase. Assumptions are things that the author must believe. Well, what does that mean for a strengthen or a weaken? Well, strengtheners are things that would make the argument more likely. Weakeners are things that would make the argument less likely. But neither of them have to be as extreme as the assumption. So a strengthener would make the argument more likely to be right. It doesn't have to promise me that it is. A weaken, right? So it would kind of bolster, prop up a pillar. A weaken would sort of chip away at a pillar. It might make my argument seem less likely, but it doesn't necessarily have to destroy my argument. So a weaken might be something like costs increased. Well, you didn't tell me how much they increased, so my conclusion still could be true, but it certainly makes me feel worse about my conclusion. If you told me that costs didn't increase or costs sort of stayed the same, then I feel a lot better about my conclusion. Yeah. And so in this case, that might actually like guarantee that my conclusion is true. So when we start to think about the like fundamental questions asked of arguments, the assumption trio are the fundamental. We get assumptions asked directly, like what is the author assuming but not saying? And then we have strengthen and weaken, which is like, well, what would make my argument feel a little better? What would make my argument feel a little worse? So these three question types, so when you say technically all true, so in this case, the strengthen would probably be the strongest of the three, but these are all three the correct answers. If the question had asked me to strengthen, this would be a correct answer. If the question asked me to weaken, this would be a correct answer. If it asked me for an assumption, this would be a correct answer. So part one of the series goes into depth about these three. Here's the thing. There's one more kind of like cousin, right? It's like maybe the middle child, so to speak, syndrome of the assumption family. We have one more, and it's called evaluate. So evaluate is technically a strengthener and a weakener combined. The way evaluate works, it's often going to be asked like a question. Like the answer choices will be questions. But evaluate is like, what do I want to know more about in order to be able to determine whether this, argument is valid? Like what information would I need more of in order to be able to assess this? So in a question like this one, a good evaluate question would just be like, have costs gone up? If they, haven't gone up, we're looking at a strengthen. If they have gone up, then that would weaken my argument. So evaluate answers are often asking for like, hey, if you knew this piece of information, or if you knew the answer to this question, it would drastically change how you feel about the conclusion. So we're going to try a couple. Now, before we try a problem, I want to make sure that you are familiar with the four-step process of critical reasoning. And again, you would have done this with my colleague last time in the first episode. Link is in the, in the notes. So when we start to deal with critical reasoning questions, the first thing we want to do is figure out which kind of question we're in. So we're going to go to the middle of the screen typically, and we're going to sort of ask like, okay, what is the question asking us to do? So step one, we are going to identify the question. What kind of CR is this? So the question we're about to work on, this is the question. There'll be an argument at the top. There'll be 5 answer choices at the bottom. But this is our question. Which of the following must be studied in order to evaluate? Language like in order to determine, in order to evaluate. These are going to be the language traditionally of our evaluate questions. And I'd say 99% of them will in fact say evaluate somewhere in the question itself. Step 2, right? So step 1, we ID the question. Step 2, we're going to deconstruct the argument. So we're going to go into this argument. We're going to read it. We're going to try and figure out like what is the conclusion? What are the premises? And then we might start to brainstorm, like what are the holes? Like what would we want to know more about? What areas would be important? So let's go ahead and do that. Here is your argument. Let's take about a minute. So generally we want to spend 45 seconds to a minute deconstructing, like reading and deconstructing the argument, so that we have another minute 15 to deal with our answer choices. Yeah, so let's take about a minute and then we will talk about how to break this down. In the chat, I would love to hear, what would you want to know more about if you wanted to try and evaluate this argument? All right, so that's about a minute. When we deconstruct, the first thing we want to do is find the conclusion. So anytime we're in an assumption family question, we always want to find the conclusion. Conclusion here, parents should do this thing, right? Parents should feed a little bit of this to their kids to figure out whether they're allergic. This question is evaluate. So what do I need to know in order to evaluate? So, right, be careful. This won't be a strengthen or a weaken. It'll be sort of the combo of the two. But my author seems to think that parents should start feeding like tiny little bite-sized pieces of, I don't know, this would be like peanuts and strawberries, I guess, the things that people are allergic to. Why? Well, because we end up with 30,000 emergency room visits each year, and the victims don't know that they're allergic to something until they're like hospitalized. And since most allergic reactions, 90% of all food allergy reactions are caused by these 8 foods, let's just go ahead and test everybody for these 8 foods. So, hey, moms, dads, and folks out there, let's just start, parents out there, let's just start feeding kids a tiny little bite. Just stick a little peanut on their lips. See what happens. So, what would I want to know more about, right? Like what would I need to study? Well, now we have our step 3. We've, kind of deconstructed. Maybe we have some ideas, maybe we don't. Our step 3 is to state the goal. So our goal, right? Like what is the goal for this kind of question? Well, it's an evaluate. And so I need to think of something that is information I'd want to know about that's like really essential to the argument. So, for example, I might not care like what the average age of a person at the emergency room is. Yeah, I might, I might not care if parents have been successful in other health interventions with their children. right? That might not matter. What I want to think about is like, what would I really need to know about? If I've got ideas, great. But more generally, I just want to think my answer has to be something that's essential to the argument. It has to be asking about something essential to the argument. It also needs to be a scenario of that switch, like I showed y'all on the other screen, which is like if we get one answer or fact, one direction would make our argument sound really good. But if we answered in the opposite way or we had the opposite piece of kind of information, we would have to demolish our argument. So once I at least have a clear picture of what I'm even meant to do and evaluate, even if I don't have any brainstormed ideas, which is fine, my final step is to then move through the answer choices. I'm going to write A, B, C, D, E on my paper. My first pass is going to be to eliminate anything that feels really unrelated. I'm going to leave anything that feels complicated or that I'm unsure of. And then my second pass through the answer choices will be to make any sort of distinctions between and among whatever answer choices are left. Okay. So here we go. Let's take another about minute 15 to at least try to eliminate as many choices as we can and then see what's left. All right. It's about a minute 20 on my end. And so lots of answers coming in, looking fantastic. As we move through the answers, rather than go through them in order, I'm going to go through them in maybe the way that I might have eliminated them. So for example, answer choice B. Does it matter to me what percent of the population is at risk for allergic reactions? They told me 30,000 emergency room visits per year. I don't know that I care that this is 30,000 out of a population of 1 million or 30,000 out of a population of 1 billion. The argument is claiming that 30,000 is a lot and that we could prevent a lot of those by making people aware of their allergies. Okay, so knowing that the percentage is 10 or 12 or 17 or 23, knowing that exact percentage doesn't change my opinion of the argument. Think about that like real clear pivot. Do I care that it's 7% of the population versus 10% of the population? No, I don't. And so we can eliminate answer choice B because it is not enough of a pivot. It isn't essential enough. This is often the case of answers or statements that could have very granular outcomes. Like, do I care if it's 7% versus 8%? Or is it 8.1 versus 8.3? Does the actual percentage really matter here? In this case, no. Similarly with C, Okay, what if they are common ingredients used in cooking? Okay, that would explain why we end up with a lot of people in the emergency room. But even if they weren't common ingredients in cooking, I still have 30,000 people showing up. They're coming into contact with these ingredients somehow. And so my conclusion still seems reasonable, right? I don't care if they're common. Clearly they're somewhere and people are being allergic to them. And so good enough. I also don't care in D whether being allergic to peanuts makes me more likely to be allergic to strawberries, or being allergic to strawberry makes me more likely to be allergic to gluten. Like, I don't care, because this argument is proposing we test all of them. So I don't care if they do or don't make me more likely. So yes or no to this question doesn't change my opinion about the argument. So let's get down to the two that most people selected. If we look at answer choice A, it's another percentage question, which is a little risky in this space. So do I need to know the exact percentage of victims who weren't aware? Well, if we look at the argument, it says often. Often would imply over half or more than none, right? Somewhat frequently. That victims of these episodes are completely unaware of their allergies until they experience a major reaction. So I know that being unaware is a problem. Does it matter if it's 29% or 30%? Would that drastically change my conclusion? Like, oh, well, if it's 30%, then okay. But if it's 29%, then no. As much as I might want to understand the depth, like it might be interesting to know how many people or what proportion of people are unaware, I've already been told that it was a problem. And so I don't need a specific data point, right? Like, is it 29%? Is it 33%? Is it 37%? Is it 49%? Is it 82%? I don't know where the cutoff would be there for it to be important. It's enough to know that it's an issue. So that leaves us on E, which hopefully is our right answer because we don't have anything else. But why would I care if a small amount is enough? Well, let's say that a very small amount of an allergen is sufficient enough to provoke an allergic reaction. Well, if it is enough, if I could just like touch your lips with a peanut, touch your lips with a strawberry, and that would set off at least some form of a reaction, then maybe this plan is a good one. I give you the tiniest little bit of it. You get a little itchy, but you don't like keel over and now we're in the hospital, with an EpiPen. However, what if a very small amount of an allergen is not enough to provoke an allergic reaction? That the only way to provoke an allergic reaction is to actually eat some strawberries or eat some peanut butter. Well, then this plan is not going to work. Parents waving a peanut in their face won't set off a reaction, and now they might think that their kid isn't allergic to peanuts. Exactly. If doing this minuscule portion isn't going to actually do anything, why would we advocate doing it in the first place? So depending on whether I say yes or no to E, yes, it is sufficient, or no, it's not, it fundamentally changes whether I think the argument is valid. And that is at its heart what we're looking for when we're looking for evaluate. Okay, so when we're trying to deal with evaluate questions, what we want to work on is this idea of what's essential here. What do I absolutely beyond a shadow need to know about to be able to test, yes, this argument is a good one. No, this argument is not good. Okay, so when we're working in the world of evaluate, we're thinking about things that strengthen and weaken simultaneously. A couple of takeaways for you before we move to our other and final kind of question type for the day. So when I see an evaluate question, I see the word evaluate in the critical reasoning question itself, I'm going to make sure that a right answer has this kind of pivot, right? Like I want to think like, okay, if I say, yes, this is true, that makes my argument go one direction. If I say, no, this isn't true, my argument goes the other direction. Okay, what if I see a critical reasoning problem and the answer choices have question marks in them? I want to highlight that that is another way to tell that I'm in an evaluate question. So you might notice that this was sort of formed like whether some, whether and, but often these questions, the answer choices themselves are questions. And so if I see answer choices that are questions, I'm also going to think of those as evaluate. And then just as like a kind of refresher for all critical reasoning problems in general, I want to make sure that I'm taking a moment to pause and state the goal before I move into my answer choices. Particularly for evaluate, I need to remind myself, like, what is evaluate? Evaluate is a combo strength and weaken. And so I need an answer that is so fundamental, or I need one of my answer choices has to be about information so fundamental to the argument that the answer to that the yes or no of that could completely fundamentally warp or change how I feel about my argument. Okay. So that closes out the assumption family. Now we're going to move to another kind of similar that we're sort of thinking of kind of oppositions question type, but of a very different flavor. And it's the explain a discrepancy question type. So we're leaving the family of conclusions with assumptions. Okay, so when we think about arguments that have holes in them, what we're thinking about is assumption, strengthen, weaken, evaluate. We're thinking of arguments that the author is drawing a conclusion that lacks support. For explain a discrepancy, what we're thinking about is bad research. Okay, so we're thinking about arguments for which the author is lazy. So let me give you an example of what I mean. So let's say I told you the following. So our little researcher has walked down the street, popped into their favorite restaurant, and noticed that the prices are so high now. They've jacked the prices up like crazy. But they're also surprised to find that they can't get a table. There's a wait out the door, and that there's like no reservations available for weeks. And our lazy researcher says, well, this is just so weird. So strange. The thing is our researcher is lazy in problems where there's a discrepancy. Lazy, or maybe just like doesn't look deeply. Because we could probably start to imagine a lot of reasons why a restaurant would increase their prices and yet still have a bunch of customers, more than they ever had before. This is the world of explain a discrepancy. Right? The discrepancy is this idea that on its face, this relationship might seem counterintuitive, that if I'm increasing my prices, I should expect to have people leave, right? Price and demand work in opposite directions. So, okay, sure, a like super simplistic, and for those of you that ever took econ or know some of your Latin, ceteris paribus, meaning all things equal. Yeah, if nothing else changed, nothing else changed, except that a restaurant raised its prices, yeah, this would be weird. But like, hey, lazy researcher, did you look to see if anything else changed too? Great examples in the chat window are like, what if all the other restaurants in town closed down? Yep. What if there is a new circus in town that just brought 1,000, there's a convention in town that brought 50,000 visitors. So of course it's not weird that the restaurant raised its prices and had more customers than ever. The town just doubled in size, right? Maybe they're offering better menu items. Maybe the owner won an award. Maybe a famous person hangs out there now. Like, oh, they're filming a movie in my town and the main star is in this restaurant every day. We better believe the restaurant's going to jack their prices up, and there's going to be a ton of people sitting in there just to like stare at this movie star. So when we look at a discrepancy problem, they're going to ask us something about the surprise or the paradox or the discrepancy. And your job is to roll your eyes and be like, there's nothing surprising. You're just lazy. You're just like really bad at your job. Like, go look. There is something out there. There is a piece of information that would resolve your confusion. You'd stop being so confused if you just did a little bit of research. Yeah. So imagine the following 4 answer choices. I do want to highlight some common trap answers in the world of discrepancy. So first, let's decide, of these 4 answer choices, which do you think the right answer could be here? Which of the following could explain how we were able to raise prices at this restaurant and still have a line out the door? What might give us a sense of like, oh yeah, that makes sense. This research is moral. So go ahead and pull in for me if you haven't. But yeah, if our restaurant was recently voted #1 in the country, that is certainly going to help me understand why they were able to pack their prices and still have a line out the door. Clearly, right? So if we look at the other answers, though, we've got some very good trap answers. And I want to sort of talk to you about why they end up being traps. So for example, D. Answer choice D is what we might call one-sided, or it might, in the sense we call it one-sided, in that it explains something. Right? In this case, it explains maybe why we raised our prices, but it doesn't explain the discrepancy that we care about. Right? So it's like, okay, I get it. Here's why you increased your prices. I'm still confused why there's a line out the door. Right? So D is going to be a wrong answer, because sure, it does explain something, but it doesn't explain the weird outcome. It doesn't help me resolve. So when you read explain a surprising finding, what I really want you to think here, the more appropriate language would be, which of the following resolves the confusion of my poor little researcher? Right? What would help their poor little noggin feel better? What about B? B is wrong, and there will almost always be wrong answers that heighten the surprise. They make the surprise worse. So sometimes people will pick this because they read explain the surprise as like enhance the surprise, make the surprise even worse. And so if the restaurant now has fewer menu choices, I would think a combination of, like, as price goes up, demand goes down. But also, if you limit my options, I'm not sure that that's going to make me happier generally. Maybe, but not in a direct sort of way. And so B is also wrong. Now, we want to be really careful of answer choices like A, because A is also wrong in this case, because I'm going to call this, it's a combo of status quo. So that means like nothing's changed, all things are the same, or equal impact, meaning we have this confusion that we've increased prices and yet the line of customers are like out the door. If we're on a busy street, theoretically, we were on a busy street before we raised our prices. So if we were on a busy street before and we're on a busy street now, that can't explain why necessarily raising our prices got us more customers. Like, okay, we're on a busy street. That would explain why maybe we were able to raise our prices some and not take a huge hit. But that thing is ceteris paribus. That thing is status quo. That thing is this. It was the same before the price increase and after. So that shouldn't be helping, right? Like it should just be kind of hanging tight in the background. So we want to be very cautious of answer choices that are like, yeah, well, but it was busy before, so I don't know how this is mitigating my change. Okay. So we're going to try one. Same 4 steps, right? So step 1, we want to start with the question itself and make sure that we understand what kind of question it is that we're being asked. So for your example question, which of the following pieces of evidence, if true, would provide the best explanation for the discrepancy, the best resolution? I want to resolve this stupid thing. Step 2, I'm going to deconstruct the argument. This time, my focus isn't conclusion because I'm not in that conclusion family, that assumption family. I'm now in discrepancy. So my goal is, what in the world is the surprise? Do tell. Tell me about this here surprise. So let's give this one a read and see what seems so surprising. So what's the surprise here? 70-ish% of people say, right, 71% of respondents to this poll said that they were going to cast votes, that they did. They said that they did it. They're like, oh yeah, we voted. However, when we actually look at voting records, it's only 60%. Yeah. Okay. So I love this, right? So I'm getting some ideas. You're like, hold the phone, lazy researcher. What could explain this? People lied to you. People do that. People have a tendency of lying in polls. People try to say things to the person on the phone that makes them sound good. And it sounds good when you vote, right? That sounds like that's something to be proud of. I voted. So people who didn't vote, maybe they just lied. There's liars. It could also be that you're not polling a representative population. This says 71% of respondents to this poll versus 60% of eligible voters, right? So maybe the people who respond to these things are not representative of the pool of actual eligible voters. So I take a moment, I pause and state the goal. I remind myself that my job is to find an answer that resolves what would resolve this discrepancy. And now once I've got like, okay, I've got to resolve this, that people are, at least respondents to the survey, are more likely to say that they voted than proportion of the actual eligible population who do vote. Cool. So let's look at our answer choices and see. If you haven't yet, start to get me a guess or maybe an actual answer if you think you got it. So now let's think about, we'll use our same process of elimination, working wrong to right. So I'll start with, answer choice A. The fact that the margin of error is 5 percentage points is not enough. It doesn't do enough. 5 percentage points doesn't get me from 71 all the way down to 60. And so, not enough. I also want to be really careful with things like a bunch of the survey's respondents were living overseas at the time. Oh, okay, 15%, maybe that's of the 29 that didn't vote. Maybe they are allowed in this country to vote, absentee, so does it matter? Not sure that this one matters. I'm going to skip over the popular answers, C and D. We'll go down to E. People are less likely to respond to a voting poll on the same day that they voted, but I don't know when this poll was taken. So this leaves me on my two most popular answers, C and D. Now, D sort of fits the, maybe they lied. Maybe not like they lied like they're bad, but like they meant to vote. They were going to vote, but then they just sort of didn't. Something happened. They're not liars, but they. However, this says that people who intend to vote are prevented from doing so. Let me see. Did this survey say that people reported intending to vote? Is that what they said? How did people respond? 71% of respondents said that they had already voted. Not that they intended to vote, but they actually had. So the fact that some people who intend to vote don't would not impact these 71% of people, because these people said, no, I did. I cast a vote. I cast a vote. I put it in the box. I did the thing. I checked the things and I went. So D, while quite tempting, is not actually the same group. So then what is C doing for me here? Well, if it is true, according to the statement, that a person who does vote is also more likely to respond to a survey, then it would make sense that the survey respondents would be more likely to be voters. And so that group isn't going to look like the full population, because that group is going to look a little bit more like voters, because voters are more likely to respond. So voters will be a larger proportion of my respondents than of the eligible voting population, which would, in fact, explain the difference in these numbers that I'm seeing. Now, there's one other question type, right, that we promised you on the agenda, and that one other question type is a fill in the blank. Here's the fun news. You just did a fill in the blank question. It turns out that the vast majority of fill in the blank questions are just discrepancy. And the way we can tell if the word before the blank will be something like since or because, but they'll be in a sentence with a however, meaning we're supporting the contrast. I'm trying to explain the weird contrasting outcome. So when you see fill in the blank, more often than not, fill in the blank is actually just a discrepancy question. Your job is to figure out what is the weird discrepancy and then how would you support it. So, however, voting records will likely show that a lower percentage of eligible voters actually voted because people who vote are more likely to respond to surveys. And so this survey, this recent poll, probably overweighted voters. Right? It would explain that weird discrepancy outcome. So to summarize this question type, what we want to think about is when I see explain a discrepancy, two things. I want to ask the question, what is surprising? And then I want to look for correct answers that resolve the issue or resolve that surprise. When I see fill in the blank, I'm going to start treating them like discrepancies. I'm going to think the same exact thing. Yeah. So we've got evaluate, we've got discrepancy, and we've got fill in the blank. Next up in the series, we'll start talking about boldface, so the structure questions, and we'll talk about coming up with our own inference or conclusions. And then we'll look at how all of this fits into the data insights section of the test, even though this is technically a verbal question type. While you're waiting for our next, make sure that you check out the first video if you didn't. Link is in the notes. Also, while you're at it, come get a free starter kit from us so you can access any GMAT, GRE, many GMAT, GRE, and EA resources for free at the manhattanprep.com website. You can also attend any of our first classes for free. So if you'd like to come in, same place, you can attend session 1 for any 9-week course or full course for free. And as an attendee, you get a discount off of your complete course registration. Use the code gmatclub75. It's valid through the end of the year. Again, if you're taking, like, these are for public courses, but again, this is for any of our complete courses for GMAT, GRE, or EA. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at our email, info@manhattanprep.com. At our website, you can chat with us directly, an option right on the main page, or you can call us at our 800, or the domestic number is on our website as well, 7 days a week. Thanks so much, y'all. I appreciate you sticking around. I cannot wait for you guys to have more in the rest of this series. So you'll enjoy the next few, and hopefully we'll see you around soon. Take care. Thanks, everyone.